in, and how many people have turned away from religion because of things that they see in the Bible. Now, typically I would save something like this for our final segment, Bible Study with Democrats, but I promised that I would do this, and I have something else I want to save to the end. So I do want to take a moment to go through one of the most controversial passages of Scripture. And this was highlighted in the debate that took place between cosmic skeptic Alex O'Connor and Ben Shapiro in their debate. I would say in the one place where Ben Shapiro kind of had the better taken of him, or however you would say that. But whenever Alex Connor got the better of him was in the conversation of slavery. And Alex brought up this verse of Scripture from Numbers 31. And I want to share it with you now so that you can kind of get the context for it. So check it out.
That maybe eventually we should be moving towards the abolition of the idea of owning human beings as private property. He just has to condone it. But yes. I still think it's the case that he would not permit a flat immorality, and I think you would agree with that too. And so when I open the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and when I look at the texts saying that when Numbers 31 has Moses instruct the slaughter of the Midianites, saying kill all the men, and this time the women get killed too, but not the women who haven't slept with a man. And why might that be? And it says that, keep them for yourselves. And I hear all the time that this is some kind of liberalizing process. Maybe it's because, these people wouldn't survive on their own. It's some kind of protective measure to make sure that you're looking after them. If that's the case, then why does it only apply to the virgins? That seems a little bit suspect to me.
Now, next to the climate activists that are doomsdayers on par with kind of the radio preacher who has predicted 50 different times that the world is going to end, and then it hasn't, and then still has a career somehow and is selling books after all that. On par with how much I love that is I love people who quote the Bible when they're a skeptic, because you can almost always rest assured that when they do so, they are going to radically pull the Bible out of context. So all I can tell you here is that is exactly what Alex O'Connor has done. So bear with me for a moment as I share with you Numbers 31 and what it actually says. So it starts off like this. The Lord said to Moses, "Take vengeance on the Midianites for the Israelites. After that you will be gathered to your people." So in other words, the Lord is calling for battle. Now, on the show before, I've argued, and I'm not really going to take the time to do it today, but I'm going to argue for just warfare, at least enough to just tell you that I don't think there's even an honest skeptic on the planet that would tell you war is never necessary in this fallen world in which we live in. I think everybody would, for the most part, agree that there is a time and a place for war. Hopefully you would agree to a degree with the fact that World War II needed to be fought because Hitler needed to be stopped. And so war has a place. The question is, by what moral basis can we judge whether or not a war is just or not? And this is where the skeptic has a real problem, because they've totally stripped themselves of any kind of moral framework that comes from any rational basis. They say human flourishing, but at the end of the day, that doesn't really even mean anything. They never really truly define what they mean by human flourishing, or what justification would really merit what human flourishing looks like. And how do you not argue for the annihilation of people with genetic defects if you're really after human flourishing? After all, that's not really that flourishing for people if you have defects and if you have handicaps. So all I'm saying is that there's an argument for some pretty horrific things if you don't have a moral basis to undergird the ideas that you have. And so people would argue the same thing about religion. They would say religion is the place where all these wars happen, and blah, 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 blah. So I'm just saying that you don't need religion for war. And in this case, in Numbers 31, it may not be what you think it is in terms of God calling for war. Is God really a genocidal maniac, or is there something more at play? So I want to continue to read and go on to verse 14 when the Israelites come back from battle. It says this: Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of the thousands and commanders of hundreds. Why was he angry for them after they returned from battle? Well, this is why. Have you allowed all the women to live? He asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourself every girl who has never slept with a man. So let me give you the appropriate context there. Essentially, Alex charges God with killing all the women except for the virgins, because of course you want to keep those prime virgins for yourself. And it's pretty convenient of these people to kill all these women and all these children and only leave for themselves the virgins so they can rape them. So God, in this passage of Scripture, according to Alex, is not only encouraging warfare, bloodlust, the death of women, but also the rape of virgins and and infanticide, because he's killing all the children. Okay, so let me give you an alternative interpretation, not based upon my hatred for religion, but actually trying to faithfully interpret the text. Because Alex conveniently left something out that I just read to you, and maybe you caught it. The reason that Moses, and essentially we can assume God, is calling for the death of these women is because of something they participated in. And what did they do? Well, according to Scripture, they marched naked into the camp to try to pull men away from God and to worship idols. And then they did that so that they could then kill all the men and destroy the Israelites. So these women used their sex appeal and their OnlyFans accounts to try to pull Israelite men away. And essentially, what we see here in Numbers 31 is that these women are not innocent women who are being killed just simply because they've had sex before. And the reason the virgins are being kept safe is not because they're virgins, it's because they didn't participate in the evil act that these other women did. Now again, that goes back into, verse 16, where it tells us that they followed Balaam's advice. Maybe you'll remember the story of Balaam, that false prophet who tried to turn God's people away from God and then was prophesying and ended up telling the guy that was trying to pay him to turn God's people away from God, ended up telling me, hey, they're not going to do it. Ultimately, you're wasting your time and you're wasting your money. And then the king insisted, and of course this is Balak. He insisted, and then he paid Balaam to come up with the idea of trying to get these women to go in and use their nakedness to try to entice these men. Essentially, these women are not innocent, suffice to say, and the virgins are. So God is actually being just here by saying, keep the virgins safe and don't kill them, don't hold them chargeable for the things that other people did. Now, I find this interesting, even though this may not be satisfying to some people because there's still death at the end of this thing. What I find interesting, though, is not only the ability to fully take things out of context, but also the inability to be able to use nuance here to tell that God is not indistinguishably killing people. What we get here, if you get anything, is the idea that God is carefully choosing these people for this act simply because of evil things that they have done. Now, as far as the death of children, it's very interesting here that the word used here is not for small children, but the word for boys. In other words, if you kill these kids' mothers for the evil work that they have done, you're going to have to kill these boys because they will later come back and try to kill you. Now, again, you may not like that very much, and it may not sit well with you, but we're also speaking about a different time. And we're also speaking about a time in which the West didn't have as much influence as it does now, which, by the way, has been largely influenced by the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. And so now we're living in a much more civilized age where this kind of stuff doesn't really happen, where people aren't, revenge killing and bringing hordes of warriors into cities to try to kill whole people groups. Thankfully, by and large, that's not something that happens much anymore. Now, certainly, we're still kind of taking babies to pagan altars to sacrifice them as they did in the Old Testament, but there are some things that have improved because of Christianity's influence, especially in the West. And so ultimately, all I'm saying is that if you put yourself within the context of Scripture, you can clearly see that what God is doing here is not indiscriminate killing, but simply charging people, making them accountable for something that they have done. Now, the second part beyond the context is just this, is that if you want to talk about slavery, and you want to talk about maybe even taking these virgin women who ultimately probably would have just suffered and died of starvation if it weren't for the Israelites taking them into their camp, I think it's important for us to also talk about the ultimate overarching claim of kind of slavery here, whether or not these virgins were slaves or willful participants marrying the men that eventually they married. We don't know. But we hear very often, regardless, that slavery is all in the Bible, and it's because the Bible is a neocolonial, patriarchal, and white somehow, even though these people were Jewish, at least will be Jewish once the Israelites are destroyed. Sorry, Mormons, and then the Jews are left. Suffice to say, we're told all these things about the Bible, and we're told that the Bible endorses slavery. It talks about slavery. Even in the New Testament, it talks about being a good servant. Haven't you ever read the book of Philemon and all of that stuff? Okay, so please just let me justify that real quick with just some simple facts from history. The kind of indentured servitude we see in the Bible is not the kind of chattel slavery we see in the transatlantic slave trade. Yes, Christians in the transatlantic slave trade had slaves because they are people at the end of the day and flawed. They didn't have slaves because the Bible justified slavery, the kind of quote-unquote slavery that we see in the Old Testament and even in the New, has more to do with indentured servitude. And if you really want to know what indentured servitude is, I would highly encourage you to check it out for yourself. But I can tell you this, essentially indentured servitude is a way more humanitarian means of welfare than the way that we put people on welfare today. So the way slavery worked in the past, in the Bible, and the kind of slavery that the Bible endorses, again, is a kind of indentured servitude that says, hey, if you need a job, maybe perhaps you need to take out a debt and you can't pay that debt back. The way that you can pay it back is you can go serve for the person who you borrowed the money from. Maybe you're not able to produce the kind of revenue, but you need the money to survive. Well, what we will do then to try to help you pay off that debt is you can come and you can work that debt off. Essentially, what's being done in indentured servitude is giving people work rather than just giving them handouts. I would argue that the welfare system of the present very often is dehumanizing, and it doesn't give people a hand up, it just gives people handouts. It doesn't really help them truly develop a skill or a trade or get a job so that they can create wealth on their own and then produce more of it. What it does is it makes them dependent upon the government. See, God didn't want to do that. And so indentured servitude was used as a means by trying to help people get to the place where they can create their own wealth. And then this is even mentioned by Alex O'Connor in one of his arguments. Apparently he just doesn't know the Bible well enough as a skeptic to really be able to interpret it well. But he talks about the year of Jubilee, when slaves would be let go totally scot-free. So after 7 years of being a slave, you could, even if your debt wasn't fully paid for, you could be totally let free. And that's something that God declared in the Bible. Now, Alex's comments is just simply, well, why put people in slavery in the first place? Yes, he's letting them go and he's ending that slavery. But why even make them slaves in the first place? Well, because he's actually not making them a slave in the sense that you think he's making them a slave. God is encouraging a kind of humanized version of welfare that if we looked at in the present, it might be actually beneficial to us and might be beneficial to the people who actually need the help. I say all that to say this simply, that you may not agree with my interpretation, but what you can't agree to is developing your own facts about portions of Scripture that you don't have enough wisdom to actually interpret the way it was intended to be interpreted. And I just wish atheists had enough humility to admit when they don't know something. But then again, if they did, they may not be atheists. They may quickly become theists.
So you just got done watching a small excerpt of a much larger episode. You can find the link to that full episode down below in the description of this video. So you definitely want to check that out, because if you like that clip, you'll like the much larger episode. And while you're at it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and click that little bell to be notified when great new episodes of Indie Thinker come your way. Thanks for watching.